Necromancers and liches are some of the most powerful and scary enemies that exist in fantasy games and RPGs. And Elder Scrolls has a very famous necromancer, Mannimarco, the King of Worms, the leader of the cult of necromancers in Tamriel. And suffice it to say, Mannimarco is an interesting character in Elder Scrolls lore. I think it's safe to say that he's somewhat of an inconsistent character. He's been sort of repurposed and retooled in a lot of different ways in the story between all the different various games to fill different roles and niches, basically. To varying degrees of effect, I would say. In this video, we're going to go on a deep lore dive of Mannimarco, the King of Worms, specifically looking at how the writing of the story of Elder Scrolls uses him. And we're going to try and figure out, does this make the story and lore of Elder Scrolls extra trippy and interesting? Why that they use Mannimarco in so many different and interesting ways? Or is this more of just bad writing that they're trying to disguise with retcons and reworkings of his character? Before we go into this lore deep dive, it would mean a lot if you would like the video and subscribe to the channel. It goes a long way to helping me make more of this content. Thank you. Proof that Mannimarco existed goes all the way back to the first era in the book Where Were You When the Dragon Broke, which is a reference to the concept in Elder Scrolls of a dragon break, which is sort of when things in Elder Scrolls decide to not follow linear time. It's somewhat of a retcon, but also they sort of wrapped it into the lore to make it an interesting concept, calling it a dragon break because the god of time is Akatosh, who is normally viewed as a dragon. So dragon break, god of time, dragon doing something. It's a little bit of lazy writing, but it's also an interesting sort of way of them fixing issues with the lore that has happened over the years. And ironically, Mannimarco seems to have his hands in a lot of dragon breaks, unfortunately. And it seems that he is involved in the very first dragon break, and we see so in the book, Where Were You When the Dragon Broke? Mannimarco, god of worms, the necromancers. The three thieves of Morrowind could tell you where they were. So could the High King Alinor, who was the one who broke it in the first place. There are others on this earth that could too. Ysmir, Pelinal, Armand the Fox, or should I say Archytas? The last dwarf would talk if they would let him. As for myself, I was here and there and here again. Like the rest of the mortals during the dragon break, how do you think I learned my mystery? The Murukati selectives showed us all the glories of the dawn, so that we might learn simply, as above, so below. Now, it seems like what Mannimarco is talking about less has to do with necromancy and more of pointing the finger of what caused the dragon break. And it seems like he's sort of pointing the finger at a bunch of historical and supernatural characters in Elder Scrolls lore. And while I don't think this has been fully explored and we're not going to fully go into this video, if I had to guess, he's sort of hinting at the fact that these supernatural people can transcend time in some fashion or another, and that's probably where they get a lot of their power, is in this ability to transcend reality. Their pseudo-godhood comes from their ability to transcend reality, which seems to be related to a dragon break, which is also transcending reality and time. In ESO, we get sort of an origin story for Mannimarco, going back to the second era. So it seems like he experienced the very first dragon break, which took place in the first era. He experienced it, but he wasn't a necromancer, the god of worms then. He was just seems to be a normal elf then. And his transformation into a necromancer began studying at the Sigic Order in the Somerset Isles on the island of Artium. And the ESO character Esul, I think that's how you pronounce that, gives us a time frame vaguely of when Mannimarco was studying at the Sigic Order. Alright, once I'm in the Trader's Vault, how do I seal away these books? Mannimarco spent his youth experimenting in the vault, and by all accounts he guarded his work jealously, storing his books in warded chests. If you place these tomes in the appropriate chests, they should be safe from would-be necromancers. What else can you tell me about Traitor's Vault? Very little, and that's by design. Even now, 300 years later, Mannimarco's influence lingers over that place. The air is thick with the smell of old books and rot. It is a place of evil, pure and simple. So this gives us sort of an idea that 300 years before the vestige in ESO, which is Second Era 582, so somewhere around 282, is when Mannimarco was studying under the Psijic Order. And while experimenting, becoming a necromancer, his fellow student, Vanus Galerion, discovers what Mannimarco is doing and leads to him getting kicked out of the Order.
Just look at this place. How in Cerebane's name did you get the right master to unlock it for you?
He rightly acknowledged our superior skill. It's only natural that he'd let us work here.
Well, it's quite a privilege.
Privilege? It's our right, Vanus. You mustn't be so humble all the time.
Oh, not this again. Come, let's explore further. What have you done? This is just repugnant.
Oh, Vanus. I would have thought you less judgmental. It's just a bit of puppetry. Nothing but arcane lift and spirit handling.
That was a living thing, Mannimarco. You're edging close to a dangerous line. Too close.
You sound like the right master. The only lines are those you draw in your mind.
I'm not going to... Please. Just find a new avenue of research, all right?
Oh, Vanus, you fool. You will never understand true power.
This is what happened to our classmates? What is wrong with you?
Wrong? Honestly, grow up, Vanus. There is no right and wrong. Only power and weakness.
You've made me for a fool. I can't believe I didn't see the rot infesting your soul. You will answer for this eventually. I swear it.
And you, my friend, will answer for your short-sightedness when I eclipse you in every way. You tattled, didn't you? You're a greater fool than I thought.
You tainted the Thapora Tower. You're worse than a murderer.
Pathetic. Do you expect Ichesis to bind me here? No. Simply banish me from the island.
That won't be enough. You're a beast, Mannimarco. A beast that needs to be caged.
Of course you're right. And once I reach the mainland, I'll show the world just how right you are. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a ritual to complete. Now, to my masterwork. If Ichesis does not see the genius of my work, he can rot with the rest of them.
And it would seem that Vanus and Mannimarco seem to have somewhat of a rivalry with one another, because Vanus would go on to form the Mages Guild, and as well as be the one who solidifies that soul gems are to be used on beasts and other non-sentient creatures, and that black soul gems would be needed to be able to store humanoids' souls. And after Mannimarco is kicked out of the Psijic Order, we're given sort of a taste of Mannimarco's brutality in the book A World of Corpses. I ask you, who suffers more than I? Who among you must withstand the infantile laments of would-be necromancers both night and day? How many souls must I retch from my impotent failures before my followers commit my truth to memory? Questions, timid apologies, simpering denials. Are these miserable wretches truly the inheritors of the dark practice? Are these the necromancers that shall carry our glorious discipline into eras to come? Perish the thought. While I find all the aspiring necromancers' queries maddening, there is one that routinely drives me to homicide. Honored Worm King, where shall we find our corpses? My response? Other necromancers will find your corpse here. Then I harvest their soul in the most painful fashion imaginable. Now, this routine did provide some small measure of personal catharsis, and I do all of Tamriel's service by winnowing the herd of deficient mages. But now, hundreds of years on, I find the entire ritual tiresome and predictable. So I have resolved to commit this simple lesson to paper. Ignore it at your peril, worms. Where shall you find corpses? Everywhere. All the world is a tomb. Every city, every field, and every forest in Tamriel has borne witness to countless slaughters and atrocities, some known and some forgotten. Wherever your foot finds purchase, rest assured, a corpse rests somewhere beneath. You need only summon up the will to call them to service. Old bones may offer some modest resistance. Time and decay make them sluggish and reclarsant. But if you cannot bend an ancient corpse to your will, you have no business calling yourself a necromancer. So long as the living remain, so too shall the dead. Finding them is a child's pursuit. Using them, though, that is the true measure of a necromancer's power. Seems like Mannimarco can't stand the lack of ingenuity from dumb necromancers. And we get an idea of how brutal he is, but also I love this little bit as just a story aside, as this is sort of his middle manager era of being a necromancer. He isn't fully up to the pinnacle of being the god of worms, I think, yet. He's still sort of working his way up to being a god of worms and having a true organization behind him. This is him where he's helping some idiots raise a zombie, and it's like The Office or something, and he can't handle being asked like stupid questions, basically. Mannimarco's storyline in ESO come to a climax with the Plane Meld and the Soulburst events that occur in the Second Era around 582. And the Soulburst and attempted Plane Meld are Mannimarco's big play for control of Tamriel and an attempt to bring Cold Harbor and Molag Bal into Nirn. This is definitely, I would say, his biggest, grandest villain moment in all of Elder Scrolls. He is making a play to take the kit and caboodle, basically. And not only that, he wants to usurp Molag Bal and take on the mantle of a Daedra. And we learn about this in the Chronicles of the Companions. My name is Lyris of Skyrim, called Titanborn by some. I'm committing these words to paper on behalf of my friend and ally, a man history will remember only as the Prophet. It was through his profound insight and his study of the Elder Scrolls that we came to understand the dire nature of the threat that now endangers all of Tamriel. Let it be known by those who read these words that the Soulburst, the event that took place in the 579th year of the Second Era, was due to the treachery of a single elf, the Altmary's necromancer Mannimarco, the king of worms and the servant of the most vile of all Daedric princes, this god of schemes and the lord of brutality Molag Bal. In years past, Mannimarco served as chief advisor to the court of Emperor Varen Aquilirus. Originally a Duke of Coral, Varen became Emperor of Tamriel by right of conquest. With Mannimarco's counsel, Varen led a revolt against the previous dynasty, the savage regime of Reachmen known as the Longhouse Emperors. Yet despite his conquest and victory, Varen was not to be a true emperor. Like the former Emperor Leovic, the blood of the dragon didn't flow through Varen's veins. He was unable to light the dragon fires in the Temple of the One, as a true emperor must by tradition. The dragon fires have remained unlit for generations. This is because the Amulet of Kings, a relic of the divines gifted unto Saint Alicia by Akatosh, was lost in the centuries following the fall of the Remen dynasty. Only this relic, traditionally worn by imperial emperors of the First Era, would allow a true-blooded ruler to spark the dragon fires anew. At Mannimarco's urging, Varen formed a group of companions to join him on an epic quest to locate this relic. These companions included myself, the Red Guard Swordmaster Sai Sahan, Grand Chancellor Abner Tharn, and Mannimarco himself. For years we scoured the face of Tamriel, following countless leads until we finally managed to locate it. When we returned to the Imperial City, Mannimarco played upon Varen's insecurities and convinced him that the coronation ritual, properly modified, could not only light the dragon fires, but persuade Akatosh to invest in him with the divine agency and gift him with the blood of the dragon. It was only after the coronation ritual was attempted that we learned the extent of Mannimarco's deception. The King of Worms used his magic to corrupt the power of the amulet, causing the calamity which came to be known as the Soulburst. I remember very little of the actual event, only that the chaos that followed was immediate and devastating. Varen was consumed by the fiery wrath of the Soulburst. Sai Sahan and I were unjustly implicated in his death, made all the more suspicious because Sai fled as soon as he recovered, taking the Amulet of Kings with him. Grand Chancellor Tharn was an opportunist and immediately cast his lot with Mannimarco. The Prophet's story is one of mystery. He appeared one day on the steps of an abbey of the moth priests in Cyrodiil. They took him in and fed him, thinking he was nothing more than a vagabond. They were shocked when they found him in the libraries that night, poring over the eldritch etchings of the Elder Scroll. Only the moth priests themselves had the ability to read the scrolls, and they saw his arrival as a prophetic sign from the divines. As they do all who read them, the Elder Scrolls eventually took the prophet's eyesight, leaving him permanently blinded. And yet he continued to study them in his mind's eye, and eventually foresaw the great and terrible threat that we are now faced with. Word of his prophecies spread far and wide, eventually reaching the imperial city in the ears of Mannimarco. The King of Worms immediately arrested the prophet for rumor-mongering and treason, and had the abbey and all of its contents burned to the ground. The catastrophe that the prophet predicted began to take shape almost immediately. Vast swaths of the empire were consumed by Daedric fire, and the first dark anchors fell upon the land. Molag Bal's invasion of our world had begun, made possible by Mannimarco's betrayal. And so this gives us proof that the Soulburst was sort of the moment that Mannimarco had planned for to take control of the empire from Varen. And this, hopefully, in his plan, was going to lead to the plane meld of melding the two planes of Molag Bal's Cold Harbor with Nirn, so that Molag Bal could rule both planes, and then Mannimarco's deeper plan was to then usurp Molag Bal and have control over both planes himself. And this is sort of our introduction point into the main character of ESO, the Vestige. Once again, I, Lyris of Skyrim, commit to words on paper on behalf of the Prophet. In truth, he didn't ask me to write this entry, but I feel the need to keep a record of these events, whatever their outcome may be. The Prophet's visions and nightmares are getting worse. He continues to witness horrifying visions of a future in which Molag Bal rules over our world. These don't seem to have a profound effect on him when he's awake, but at night, in those precious few hours where he manages to drift off, the visions become increasingly disturbing. He refuses to describe them to me in great detail, but he awakens violently in a cold sweat, and it's obvious that they are wearing away at his sanity. Our ally, the Vestige, has already proven extremely capable. The escape from the Wailing prison was only the beginning. The Vestige risked everything to rescue me from the Foundry of Woe. I owe our new friend my life, my soul, and perhaps my very sanity. We're now chasing every available lead in our attempts to find Sai Sahan and the Amulet of Kings. If we can regain the amulet, the Prophet believes that we might be able to challenge Molag Bal and save our world. As usual, he used a bunch of flowery words and obscure phrases I didn't understand, but his general meaning was clear. Sometimes I'd wish I never left Skyrim and gone to Cyrodiil. I fought for a great man that I believed in, met another that I came to cherish dearly, and had my share of blood and glory. But was it all worth it? Cyrodiil will always be the place where I first laid eyes on that traitorous skeever Mannimarco, and his sniveling, toady Abner Tharn. I don't know which is worse, Mannimarco's charm and eloquence as he prepared to backstab us, or Tharn's endless insults and irritating condescension. At least with Tharn, we always knew where we stood. The Prophet said that Tharn's part in this isn't finished. I can't imagine any good coming of that. After all, that sniveling son of a goat went right back to licking Mannimarco's boot after the Soulburst. He'd do anything to save his own hide and preserve his family's status in the Imperial City. I must bring this entry to a close. I hear the Prophet stirring. And from continuing to read on the Chronicles of the Five Companions, we learn that the Prophet is actually Varen in sort of a changed form. I have to admit, I'm kind of getting some sort of Martin Septon vibes. He definitely dies at the end of this storyline, so I'm kind of getting that kind of feeling from it. And then Abner Tharn actually ends up being a double agent for Varen, so he's not actually as bad as his later offspring, Jagar Tharn, who's the main bad guy of Arena, will be. The end of this storyline of ESO, the Vestige and the Five Companions defeat the Vestige and the other four companions defeat Mannimarco, kill him, and his soul is captured by Molag Bal to be tortured for eternity. And I have to say, this is sort of a lot of irony that Mannimarco says that this death is just the first step in his immortality. I think it's somewhat of a hint at the writers of the ESO story that Mannimarco kind of dies a lot. This is sort of his, if you're thinking about it in terms of the chronological, in our world, showings of his deaths, this is the last one, but historically in Elder Scrolls, it's the first one. And I think that this is somewhat of a I think, a cop-out, that they're trying to justify all of his deaths that occur by saying that, well, this is just him being a necromancer and him reanimating himself each time, basically. And we're even given a story of Mannimarco's rival Vanus Galerion killing Mannimarco in the book from Oblivion, Mannimarco, King of Worms. O sacred isle Arctium, where rosy light infuses air, o'er towers and through flowers gentle breezes flow, softly sloping green-kissed cliffs to crashing foam below, always springtide afternoon housed within its border. This mystic, mist-protected home of the Sigic order, those counselors of kings cautious, wise, and fair. 10 years and 30 since the mighty Remen fell. 2 brilliant students studied with the Sigic's fold. One heart was light and warm, the other dark and cold. The madder ladder, Mannimarco, whirled in a deathly dance, his soul in bones and worms, the way of the necromance. And trapping and enslaving souls, he casted a wicked spell. The former, Galerion, had magic bold and bright as day. He confronted Mannimarco beneath gray Sepora Tower, saying, your wicked mysticism is no way to wield your power. Bringing horror to the spirit world, your studies must cease. Mannimarco scoffed, hating well the ways of life and peace, and returned to his dark artistry, his paints, death and decay. Sacred isle Arctium, how slow to perceive the threat, when the ghastly truth revealed, how weak the punishment. The ghoulish Mannimarco from the isle of the wise was sent. To the mainland dawns beauty, more death and souls to reap. You have found a wolf and sent the beast to flocks of sheep. Galerion told his masters, a terror on Tamriel has set. Speak no more of him, the sage cloaks of grey did say. 'Twas not the first time Galerion thought his masters callous, unconcerned for men and myrrh, aloof in their island palace. 'Twas not the first time Galerion thought 'twas time to build a new order to bring true magic to all, a mighty mages guild. But 'twas the time he left at last fair Arctium's azure bay. Oh, but sung we have of Vanus Galerion many times before, how cast he off the Sigic's chains, bringing magic to the land. Throughout the years he saw the touch of Mannimarco's hand. Through Tamriel's deserts, forests, towns, mountains, and seas, the dark crypts stretching out, growing like dread disease. By his dark necromancers collecting cursed artifacts of yore, they brought to him these tools, mad wizards and witches, and brought blood-tainted herbs and oils to cave of sin. Sweet Kaviri poison, dust from saints, sheafs of human skin, toadstools, roots, and much more cluttered his alchemical shelf. Like a spider in his web, he sucked all their power into himself. Mannimarco, Worm King, world's first of undying liches. Corruption on corruption till the rot sunk to his very core. Though he kept the name Mannimarco, his body and his mind were but a living, moving corpse as he left humanity behind. The blood in his veins became instead a poison acid stew. His power and his life increased as his fell collection grew. Mightiest were these artifacts, long cursed since the days of yore. They say Galerion left the guild, calling it a morass, but untruth is a powerful stream, polluting the river of time. Galerion beheld Mannimarco's rise through powers sublime. To his mages and lamp knights, before my last breath, face I must the tyranny of worms and kill at last undeath. He led them north to cursed lands, to a mountain pass. Oh, those who survived the battle say it was like never seen. Armored with magicka, armed with enscrolled sword and axe, Galerion cried echoing, Worm King, surrender your artifacts, and their power to me, and you shall live as befits the dead. A hollow laugh answered, You die first, Mannimarco said. The mage army then clashed with the unholy force obscene. Imagine waves of fire and frost in the mountain shivers. Picture lightning arcing forth, crackling in a dragon's sigh. Like leaves the battle mages fly to rain down from the sky. At the necromancer's call, corpses burst from earth to fight, to be shattered into nothingness with a flood of holy light. A maelstrom of energy unleashed, blood cascades in rivers. Like a thunder burst in blue skies or a lion's sudden roar. Like sharp razors tearing over delicate embroidered lace. So at a touch did Galerion shake the mountain to its base. The deathly horde fell fatally, but heeding their dying cries, from the depths the thing they called Worm King did rise. Nirn itself did scream in the mages in the Necromancer's war. His eyes burning dark fire, he opened his toothless maw, vomiting darkness with each exhalation of his breath. All sucking in the fetid air felt the icy touch of death. In the skies above the mountain, darkness overcame pale. Then Mannimarco, Worm King, felt his dismal powers fail. The artifacts of death pulled from his putrid skeletal claw. 1,000 good and evil perished then, history confirms. Among, alas, vanished Galerion, he who showed the way. It seemed once that Mannimarco had truly died that day. Scattered seemed the Necromancers, wicked, ghastly fools. Back to the Mages Guild, victors kept the accursed tools. Of him living still in undeath, Mannimarco, King of Worms. Children, listen as the shadows cross your sleeping hutch, and the village sleeps away, streets emptied of the crowds, and the moons do balefully glare through the nightly clouds. And the graveyards people rest, we hope in eternal sleep. Listen, you'll hear the whispered tap of the footsteps creep. Then pray you'll never feel the Worm King's awful touch. So I have to say, it's a cool poem, and it's interesting, but once again, we have another story of Mannimarco being destroyed for the final time, supposedly, in this story from Oblivion, which also gives us some background on where the artifacts that we collect for the Mages Guild come from. But once again, supposedly, this is supposed to be the end of Mannimarco, but obviously that definitely is not the case, as this is his second ending, and we're only halfway through all of his endings. And I have to say about the ESO writing for this storyline, it seems a little too close to Oblivion's. Like Varen seems to just kind of be Martin, and Molag Bal seems to be Mehrunes Dagon, and Mannimarco just seems to be Mankar Cameron. Seems like the parallels are just a little too strong for me, in my opinion. I think ESO is cool, but they have a lot of volume of the lore and writing of Elder Scrolls, but I would say for the most part, it's not the most interesting part of Elder Scrolls lore. That seems to be in the mainline games themselves. But with that, we can finally move on to the third era, where Mannimarco shows up again. And Mannimarco, the King of Worms, is a faction in Daggerfall attempting to gain the Totem of Tiber Septim and the Mantella. Most factions in Daggerfall want the Totem and the Mantella so that they can control the Numidium, which is a giant megazord, basically, made by the Dwemer with the heart of Lorkhan. And with the Numidium, any faction could probably take control of Daggerfall and possibly take control all of Tamriel. But Mannimarco doesn't want the Totem and Mantella so that he can do that. He just wants to use the power in it so that he can ascend to Godhood into Aetherius, which is explained to us in a letter that we receive from the King of Worms when we finally get the Totem. A hand grips your wrist from behind, spinning you open your mouth to shout for the guards. A skeletal hand stuffs a letter into your mouth. The heavily robed skeleton releases your wrist and turns away, unnoticed by passerby. The letter reads, "You will soon have the Totem of Tiber Septim in your hands. It is foreseen in the stars, and I have read them. Know you this, all of mortal stature are filled with pride and greed. To give the totem to any of them is to let loose mortal vanity upon this world. They will destroy the very thing they covet. I have no earthly desires. I have no mortal pride, no petty greed. Only one such I can wield the totem safely. For I would take it into Aetherius and leave behind this earthly shell. So long as the totem exists, it is a danger to all of Tamriel. Bring me the totem and I will safeguard the world. I will not offer you gold or gems. I will offer you what only I can give, fame. Your reputation throughout Tamriel will soar. Lord of the Necromancers, King of the Worms." And then once you finally give him the totem, he will tell you, "The totem, at last it is within my grasp. You have done well. I shall remember this when I have transformed. Search now for the Mantella. Without it, the totem is worthless. In the meantime, enjoy the adoration of the world." So it seems like this is a mellowed out Mannimarco. This is also the first time in the video games we actually do get to see Mannimarco. And it seems like he's much more mellower, a lot more chill. He's like not so into earthly desires. He's much more enlightened, much more of like he's got this sort of Buddhism to himself now. I guess after he's been destroyed twice, even though obviously when they wrote this, those weren't things that the writers knew, but I guess they just decided to make a chill necromancer, I guess, back then. Very odd choices here. Never thought that I would... My first rendition of a necromancer, I'd make him super chill, and he just wants to ascend to godhood and not mess with the world anymore. I guess, of course, there is the possible horror of what he could be doing once he obtains godhood. So I guess there is that sort of, this is an evil thing you're doing by letting him ascend to Aetherius. And in Daggerfall, you can pick whoever you want to win the war between all the different factions, but canonically, the outcome of Daggerfall is a dragon break where every faction, for the most part, gets what they want. And that is, the Warp in the West describes that. And we're not going to go super into the Warp in the West or dragon breaks in this video. That could probably be its own video. I think it will be its own video at some point. But in the book Necromancer's Moon, we kind of get a confirmation that Mannimarco's goal of ascending into Aetherius is accomplished after the Warp in the West. Brothers and sisters of the Worm, despair not at the trials we now face, for our time comes swiftly. The God of Worms watches over our order, and will deliver us from these troubled times on the day of reckoning. Until then, perform his works in secret, serve his needs, and look to the skies for his signs. The Revenant, the Necromancer's Moon, watches over us all. His form, ascended to godhood, has taken its rightful place in the sky, and hides the enemy Arche from us so that we may serve him. Watch for the signs when the heavenly light descends from above. Hasten to his altars and make your offering, so that he may bless you with but a taste of his true power. Grand soul gems offered to him will be darkened, and can be used to trap the souls of the unwitting, a feat even the great Nagast would marvel at. Stay faithful to the order of the Black Worm, and in your time your loyalty will be rewarded. Soon he will return to set the world right in due time, and those who would stand in his way will suffer eternally at his hands, just as those who stood opposed before. Until that day, you must believe and be patient. Hide in your caves, in your ruined forts, in your secret lairs. Raise your minions, summon your servants, cast your spells. Answer the call of the order when you are needed. Watch and listen. So this illustrates to us that yes, at the end of Daggerfall, Mannimarco ascends to godhood through the Warp in the West, and that now he has become a celestial body the way the other Aedra have, and once every certain amount of time blocks Arche's celestial body, and that's when the necromancers can make their black soul gems so that they can harvest the souls of sentient people. I have to say, it's all very interesting. Like, this is actually a part of the cosmology that is really interesting, how they are able to tie him becoming a god, becoming a celestial body, and then how that even connects to how necromancers make black soul gems. Actually is really interesting, and actually is a good bit of writing that then ties into the gameplay of the Elder Scrolls games. But it is a little iffy on what kind of god is Mannimarco at this point. He's not a Daedra, because Daedra don't have celestial bodies, so does this mean he is an Aedra, technically? Because they are the ones with celestial bodies. So, in some ways, kind of makes him a more legitimate, quote-unquote, god than the Daedra, I guess? I mean, that's a loose interpretation. But very odd, very interesting to think about. And unfortunately, though, we're not really given those sort of defined details. And this leads us to the Mages Guild questline in Oblivion, where Mannimarco is sort of the big bad villain at the end of that game, of that storyline. The Necromancer cult is gaining popularity again, and is attempting to take down the Mages Guild because the Mages Guild has outlawed the practice of necromancy. And this was because of the current Mages Guild Archmage Hannibal Travin. And we read about this in the book The Black Arts on Trial. History. Necromancy, commonly called the Black Arts, has a history that dates back before recorded time. Virtually all the earliest laws of the land make mention of it as expressly forbidden on pain of death. Independent practitioners of the arts of sorcery, however, continued its study. The Sigic Order of the Isle of Artanium, precursor to our own Mages Guild, also forbade its use, not only because it was dangerous, but their belief in the holy and unholy ancestor spirits made it heretical. Again, despite this, we hear many stories of students and masters who ignore this stricture. When Vanus Galerion left Artium, he may have disagreed with the Sigics on much, but he also refused to allow necromancy to be taught in the guild. Almost 1100 years have passed since the time of Vanus Galerion, and there have been many archmages to lead the guild. The question of necromancy has continued to be asked. The strictures against it in the guild have never been lifted, but attitudes about it have shifted back and forth over the years. Some archmagisters have been inclined to ignore it entirely, some have fought very actively against it, and still other archmagisters have been rumored to be necromancers themselves. In my new role as archmagister of the Mages Guild, it is my duty to set the policy on this matter. Though I have my own opinions on the black arts, I took counsel with two of the most learned mages in the Empire, Magister Voth Careless of Corinth and Magister Seta Grog Cog of Orsinium, and we debated for 2 days. What follows are summaries of the salient points of the debate, arguments and counter-arguments, which led to the resolution of the Mages Guild on the subject of necromancy. Argument by Master Grokog. Necromancy is poorly understood. We will not make it disappear by ignoring it. As an intellectual institutions dedicated to the study of the magical arts and sciences, we have obligations to the truth. Censoring ourselves and our scholarship is antithetical to our mission of neutrality and objectivity. Counter-argument by Master Carless. The Mages Guild must balance its quest for knowledge with responsible caution and ethical standards. It is not censoring a student's course of study to have him proceed cautiously and with purity of purpose. It is not limiting a student's freedom to set rules and boundaries. Indeed, it is an essential. Argument by Master Carless. Necromancy is an anthem throughout the civilized world. To embrace it publicly, the Mages Guild would inspire fear and hostility in the populace at large. Vanus Galerion wanted this institution to be unlike the Sigic Order, which was elitist and separatist. We ignore public opinion at our own risk. We will certainly lose our charters in many places, including very likely the whole of Morrowind, where sentiment against necromancy is very strong. Counter-argument by Master Grokog. Yes, we should be sensitive to the concerns of the community, but they should not and must not dictate our scholarship. Necromancer to many uneducated persons simply means an evil mage. It is madness to limit our work because of prejudices and half-formed understanding. It is an affront to the purpose of objective study to turn our back on a subject merely because of public opinion. Argument by Master Grokog. Necromancers are the scourge of Tamriel, whether operating independently or in concert with the Slodes or King of Worms Mannimarco. They are responsible for many horrors, animated zombies and skeletons, and other forms of undead. To best combat this menace, we must understand the powers of the Necromancer, and we cannot do that by restricting our study of the black arts. Counter-argument by Master Carless. No one is disputing the threat of the black arts. In fact, that is the very essence of my argument against the Mages Guild making it a school to be taught to our initiates. We can and should know what our enemy is capable of, but we must be careful not to step into a trap of looking too deep into his ways, making those ways our own. We do no one any good if by studying the evil ways we become evil ourselves. Argument by Master Carless. Necromancy is inherently dangerous. One cannot dabble in it. The simple spell requiring the spilling of blood and immediately begins to corrupt the caster's soul. This is not conjecture, but simple fact. It is irresponsible of the guild to teach and thereby encourage a sort of magical study which has proven itself time and time again to bring nothing but terror and misery on the practitioner of the world. Counter-argument by Master Grokog. All schools of magic are dangerous to the uninitiated. A simple fireball spell from the School of Destruction can cause great harm when cast by a novice, not only to others but to the mage themselves. The School of Mysticism by its very nature forces the practitioner to divorce his mind from logic, to embrace a temporary sort of insanity, which one might argue is very like corrupting one's soul. Argument by Master Grokog. The guild already permits some forms of necromancy. The schools of Magicka are, as we know, artificial constructs originally formulated by Vanus Galerion to divide and thereby simplify study. They have changed many times throughout the years, but at their heart, every master knows they are all linked together. When a student of conjuration summons a guardian ghost, he is touching the school of necromancy. When a student of enchantment uses a trapped soul, he too may be considered guilty of a black art. The school of mysticism, as I have stated before, has some kinship with necromancy as well. To state that students may not learn the ways of necromancy is to stifle common skills in the other. More historically legitimate schools of the guild. Counter-argument by Master Carlos. Yes, the schools are intertwined, but the standard spells of each school have passed the proof of time. We know that a student of mysticism, properly instructed, will not be permanently harmed by his experience. In many ways, it is a question of extremes. How far would we permit our studies to take us? Necromancy, by its nature, relies on the practitioner going further into the darkness than it is wise, virtually guaranteeing his destruction. It has no place in the Mages Guild. Conclusion. The risks of studying necromancy outweigh its usefulness. The guild does not wish to censor the study of any of its members, but it will not tolerate studies in the black arts, except in limited form for the purpose of combating its evil adherents. This may only be done by rare individuals who have proven themselves both highly skilled and highly cautious, and then only with express permission and supervision. Afterward, I regret to acknowledge the truth behind the rumor that Master Usita Grakog was more than an apologist for necromancy. She was a necromancer herself. Upon this revelation, the Knights of the Lamp attempted to arrest her at the guild house in Orsinium, but she made good on her escape. We have every confidence in the replacement magister in Orsinium. Though I disagreed, I respected her logical reasoning enough to include her arguments in this book. I see no reason to remove them. It is disappointing, however, to see that her interest in the truth was nothing more than a euphemism for her slavery to the black arts. This unfortunate situation merely illustrates how essential it is for guild members to be wary of the lure of necromancy, and to be vigilant against its practitioners' infiltration in our Mages Guild. I love this argument between necromancy or not to do necromancy. It is very much a great example of the Overton window of how someone holding steadfast to a position that is inherently insane can still be somewhat talked about in a civilized way. Kind of reminds me of a lot of political discussion in our current climate in real life, but I will avoid diving into that. But this gives us a background onto why the Mages Guild has banned necromancy and does not want it to be practiced in Tamriel. So before going super into the quests of the Mages Guild, I do have to say, boy oh boy, is the Mages Guild in Oblivion so incompetent. They are so incompetent. Every single guild hall you go to get a recommendation from is just full of nincompoops. And then once you get to the Arcane University, everyone is just incompetent and you have to clean up all of their messes. And so you eventually do all that. You fight and kill a bunch of necromancers. And with the colossal black soul gem, the archmage decides to sacrifice himself so that when Mannimarco tries to control you with a spell, it will fail. And I have to say, it's, I think, a mistake in the game, because I think you're supposed to gather that from the situation, that he puts his own soul into the colossal soul gem, but he doesn't expressly say that. And I think it maybe the line got cut or something, I'm not 100% sure, but it's just like, you're told to go confront Mannimarco, and then the archmage just kills themselves. And you're just kind of standing there like, what the fuck is happening? What was going on? But you, as the hero of Kvatch, you go to Mannimarco, you kill him. He seems to be just pretty much a normal boss, nothing super fancy about him. But once again, this is the fourth canonical death of Mannimarco, this time in his physical form, even though he also has a celestial body, so you've killed a god, I guess, in some sense. And this has no effect on his celestial body because the Necromancer's moon still exists into Skyrim, where necromancers still make black soul gems. And I have to say, this is kind of where my criticism of the use of Mannimarco throughout the years, I kind of take issue with. They kind of just seem to use him wherever it makes the most amount of sense, and they kill him off in a lot of different ways, and they make it seem like this is the final time, you have finally killed off Mannimarco. But then he just eventually comes back. And I find it very interesting that chronologically, his final death is like probably the most anticlimactic death for him, It would be nice just for them to try and at least wrap this up in a coherent manner, because it seems like they don't really explain why he's able to be destroyed and then come back, and then destroyed and come back. They don't really seem to explain any of that. Is he a zombie? Is someone turning him into a zombie so that he can keep doing this? It's all kind of really convoluted and just not really the best writing, obviously. And I will admit that part of Elder Scrolls lore that I really like is sort of the wacky and craziness, but this just seems kind of lazy and silly at this point. I mean, I think that there is an opportunity to see Mannimarco again in Elder Scrolls 6, because if it's going to be in Hammerfell, that's going to be close to Daggerfall. They could address the warp in the west, as well as Mannimarco's ascension into Godhood, and sort of maybe give a better explanation of what caused all of that. But also at the same time, it might be better just to let sleeping dogs lie. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the lore of Mannimarco, the King of Worms, the ultimate necromancer of Elder Scrolls. It would mean a lot if you would like the video and subscribe to the channel, and if you would consider becoming a channel member. It really helps make more of this content. Thank you.